There are moments in the human psyche when the veil between light and shadow tears open, revealing what we were never meant to see. Compassion, so often hailed as virtue, carries within it a silent danger, an excess that can twist love into rage, tenderness into violence. Tonight, we step into one of Carl Jung's most unsettling cases, where empathy itself became the doorway to terror. What happens when the healer, the one who carries everyone's pain, can no longer carry their own? What hidden force emerges when the empath, the eternal comforter, finally breaks? Jung uncovered not just a patient's collapse, but a terrifying truth about all of us, that even empathy has a shadow, and when it snaps, the unconscious unleashes a power that can consume everything. When we speak of the empath, we often imagine a figure bathed in gentle light, someone who feels so deeply that they seem to dissolve into the emotions of others. But beneath that light lies a shadow, and it is this shadow that Jung feared the most. To be an empath is not only to feel, but to absorb, to take into one's soul the unspoken agonies of others. The wounds of strangers, the grief of friends, the despair of the collective, all of it gathers, drop by drop, within the empath's inner vessel. And here lies the danger: every vessel, no matter how vast, can overflow. Jung would say that the shadow is not merely the darkness we hide, but the neglected truth of our being. For the empath, the shadow forms not out of cruelty or selfishness, but out of the sheer impossibility of endless giving. Imagine carrying within you the sorrow of 10 lives, then 20, then 100. At first, the empath believes this is their calling, their sacred duty, but slowly, the weight bends their spine, darkens their dreams, and saturates their unconscious with voices that are not their own. The empath's shadow grows not from malice, but from exhaustion. The smile that comforts another masks the silent scream of a self being neglected. And what Jung found most terrifying in this case was not the presence of evil, but the slow corrosion of goodness itself. The more the empath gave, the more they dissolved. And in the dissolving, the shadow, hungry, patient, inevitable, waited for its moment to erupt. You must understand, shadow overwhelm is not sudden. It creeps. It begins in the dreams, where archetypes twist into new forms. The empath, once dreaming of clear waters and radiant figures of healing, begins to dream of drowning. Faces without eyes crowd the shore, demanding salvation, pulling them deeper into the sea. These are not random nightmares. These are psychic warnings, symbols of a soul suffocating under borrowed griefs. Jung taught us to read dreams as messages from the unconscious, and in this case, every dream cried the same truth: you are vanishing into others. Your shadow will not let you disappear quietly. By day, the empath still played their role, the helper, the healer, the one who always listened, but subtle cracks appeared. A sudden sharpness in tone, a flash of irritation that shocked even themselves. These were the whispers of the shadow, testing the boundaries, asking, "When will you let me speak?" The more the empath resisted, the louder those whispers became. And Jung, ever the watchful observer, knew what was coming. For the psyche does not tolerate imbalance. The shadow will always rise to restore what has been denied. What makes this overwhelming shadow so terrifying is that it does not come as an enemy from outside, but as a transformation from within. The empath does not recognize themselves in the mirror. Their eyes seem harder, their words heavier, their gestures tinged with something unfamiliar. Jung described it as a possession, not by a demon of folklore, but by an archetype long suppressed, the destroyer hidden inside the healer. This is the paradox of the empath. The one who feels most deeply for others is also the one who, if broken, can unleash the darkest storm. The shadow's arrival does not mean the empath was false or insincere. On the contrary, their compassion was genuine, too genuine. They had given themselves away, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the buried rage of neglect. Rage at the world for asking too much. Rage at themselves for never saying no. Rage at the endless suffering that no amount of kindness could erase. and when that rage surfaces, it does so with the ferocity of all the years it was silenced. This is shadow overwhelm, not the sudden turn of a cruel heart, but the implosion of a heart that could not contain the suffering it carried. Jung's writings remind us that the unconscious is not moral, it seeks wholeness, not goodness. The empath's shadow, once awakened, did not care for reputation, kindness, or the expectations of others. It demanded expression, balance, the recognition that one cannot live entirely for others without murdering the self. And so, the empath snapped, not in the way of wild hysteria, but with a chilling clarity, as though another voice had taken command, a voice that said, "Enough, no more." This is why Jung found the case so haunting. Because it was not the story of a fragile soul succumbing to madness, but the revelation of a law within the psyche. Even compassion has limits. Even love, when stretched beyond measure, fractures into its opposite. The empath's shadow was not their enemy. It was their neglected twin, their dark mirror, rising with terrifying force to claim its rightful place. Shadow overwhelm is not merely personal. It reflects something universal, something every society must face. For we too, collectively, ask our empaths to bear the world's wounds, to listen endlessly, to comfort without rest. And yet, we rarely ask who comforts them, who absorbs their sorrow when their soul begins to crack. Jung's case forced him, and us, to confront the truth. The more we ignore the shadow, the more violent its return will be. And so, in this unfolding, we see the empath not only as healer but as warning, a living parable of the danger of imbalance, a mirror of how easily light can become darkness when shadow is denied. For to be overwhelmed by shadow is not to be weak, but to be human, to reveal the hidden law that what is repressed will always return, and when it does not whisper, it roars. In Jungian psychology, the process of individuation is the great work of the soul, the journey of becoming whole, of uniting conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, the fragmented parts of the psyche into a living totality. But what happens when this journey is interrupted, when it surges forward with such violence that it threatens to shatter rather than unite? This is what Jung witnessed in the empath's most terrifying case, a breaking point that revealed not only the burden of compassion, but the crisis of individuation itself. The empath had always believed that their gift of feeling was their identity, their essence, the very meaning of their existence. They moved through life as a vessel for others, defining themselves through the suffering they absorbed and the comfort they offered. Yet in Jung's analysis, such devotion was not true individuation, but a mask, an identification with a single aspect of the self. To become only the healer, only the comforter, was to refuse the full complexity of the soul. Individuation demands more. It demands wholeness, not perfection, and wholeness requires that even the darkness, the rage, the selfishness be acknowledged and given form. But the empath resisted. To embrace their shadow felt like betrayal, like cruelty, like abandoning the very identity they had built. And so they clung to the image of the eternal giver, suppressing the rising whispers of fatigue, the subterranean anger, the longing to be seen as more than a caretaker. The unconscious, however, will not allow itself to be denied. The more the empath repressed, the more violently the repressed returned. This was not mere emotional exhaustion. It was a psychic rebellion. The self, the archetypal core of the personality, demanded integration. The dreams grew more insistent. No longer gentle metaphors, they became apocalyptic visions, burning cities, collapsing bridges, children screaming for help, while the dreamer's arms were bound. Jung interpreted these not as signs of insanity, but as messages of a deeper truth. The empath had reached the threshold where the self could no longer tolerate one-sidedness. The structures of identity were collapsing because they had been built on half a soul. What the dreams demanded was terrifying. Let the old self die so that the whole self might emerge. This is the individuation crisis, the moment when the mask crumbles, when the persona, the role we play for the world, can no longer contain the enormity of the unconscious. For the empath, the crisis came in silence, in a sudden stillness where they realized they no longer knew who they were. If they were not only the giver, the listener, the healer, then what was left? The abyss yawned before them, the dread of emptiness, of becoming nothing. Yet Jung knew this emptiness was not annihilation but initiation. The void was the womb of the self, demanding surrender before rebirth. The empath snapping, then, was not mere collapse. It was the eruption of the unconscious into consciousness, a violent confrontation between the old identity and the emerging totality. Words they had never spoken burst from their lips, words of anger, of refusal of self, assertion that shocked those who knew them. Acts they had long condemned in others surfaced in their own hands. This was not hypocrisy but necessity, the psyche's demand for balance. For individuation does not mean becoming only good, only light, only virtuous. It means becoming whole, and wholeness includes the dark as much as the bright. Jung observed that those who repress their shadow most fiercely are often seized by it most violently. The empath's crisis exemplified this law. Their life had been one long denial of selfishness, one long refusal to admit their own needs, and so the shadow erupted in exaggerated form. They became for a time what they had most despised, harsh, unyielding, even cruel. Those around them recoiled, unable to reconcile this new figure with the gentle soul they once knew. But Jung recognized this transformation as part of the greater work, the storm that precedes integration. The individuation crisis is terrifying because it strips away everything familiar. The empath's identity dissolved, leaving them in the chaos of the unknown. Yet within this chaos lay the seeds of rebirth. Jung often spoke of alchemy, of the prima materia that must be broken down before it can be transformed into gold. The empath was living this alchemical process, though at the time it felt like madness. The snapping was not destruction for its own sake. It was dissolution, the breaking apart of an incomplete self so that a truer self could emerge. And here lies the haunting truth Jung discovered. Compassion alone cannot complete the soul. To live only for others is to live half a life. The self demands integration of opposites. The saint and the sinner, the giver and the taker, the healer and the destroyer. When the empath reached their breaking point, it was because they had denied too much for too long. The crisis of individuation forced them to confront what they had feared, that to become whole, they must embrace not only their capacity to love, but their capacity to rage, to refuse, to claim space for themselves. This was the terror of the case. That individuation is not a gentle ascent, but a crucible. It demands death before rebirth, confrontation with the darkest parts of the psyche, and the courage to let go of the comforting mask. The empath had lived as the embodiment of light, but light alone cannot sustain the soul. It was only when the shadow broke through, when the identity of eternal healer collapsed, that the deeper work could begin. The individuation crisis revealed itself not as failure, but as necessity. The snapping of the empath was the cracking of a shell, the violent rupture through which the self forced its way into consciousness. And though it was terrifying, Jung understood it as inevitable, for no soul can remain divided forever. In Jung's most unsettling cases, there is a moment when the personal dissolves and what steps forward is no longer merely human, but archetypal. Archetypes are not inventions of the mind. They are ancient patterns, primordial forces dwelling in the collective unconscious, waiting for the right moment to seize the fragile fabric of individuality. For most of us, they remain background currents, shaping dreams, nudging choices, coloring emotions. But for the empath, at the breaking point, one of these forces surged into dominance. What Jung called possession took place. The self was eclipsed, and an archetype wore the empath like a mask. The empath had lived identified with the archetype of the healer. Their existence revolved around absorbing pain, soothing wounds, sacrificing their own needs for the needs of others. This archetype can be luminous, even saintly, but like all archetypes, it carries its opposite within it. To live entirely as the healer is to court its shadow, the destroyer. And when the empath's inner balance collapsed, it was not merely fatigue or anger that emerged, but the full eruption of the destroyer archetype. Jung described such moments as terrifying because the possessed individual no longer acts from their own conscious will. They become the instrument of something larger, something impersonal, an energy that has always existed in the human psyche, but rarely erupts with such raw force. In the empath's case, this possession turned their compassion into its opposite. Their words, once soothing, became venomous. Their gestures, once gentle, carried an undercurrent of violence. They had not simply changed moods, they had become the living expression of an archetypal reversal. This shift was visible even in their presence. Jung noted how their eyes seemed different, as though another intelligence looked through them. The aura of warmth that once surrounded them now carried a cold, unsettling intensity. Those closest to them described the sensation of standing before a stranger, though the face was the same. It was as if the mask of the healer had cracked, and from beneath it, the destroyer looked out. Dreams confirmed this possession. Figures once saved by the dreamer now turned into accusers. Buildings that were once sanctuaries now erupted into flames. The archetypal images of salvation gave way to archetypal images of destruction. Jung understood these dreams not as random nightmares, but as reflections of the archetype that had seized control. The unconscious had shifted its balance, and what emerged was not personal rage alone, but a collective force, the eternal pattern of death and rebirth, destruction as the precursor to renewal. What makes archetypal possession so chilling is that it bypasses individuality. The empath was no longer simply themselves. They were a vessel of something beyond their own life, something belonging to the timeless psychic structures of humanity. Their cruelty was not random, their sharpness not petty. It was mythic, echoing the archetypes of wrathful gods, destructive storms, or the avenging angel that strikes with terrible clarity. Jung often warned that when archetypes erupt into consciousness unmediated, they consume the ego, dragging the individual into roles they cannot control. The empath's case revealed precisely this danger. Their personal boundaries had dissolved so completely into the suffering of others that when the unconscious demanded balance, it did not simply return their own neglected needs. It unleashed the archetype opposite to the one they had identified with. In living entirely as the healer, they had invited the destroyer to step forward with equal force. And when it did, the transformation was not gradual, but sudden, total, and overwhelming. Archetypal possession also manifests in the way the world responds. People around the empath felt the shift, not as mere personality change, but as something uncanny, something charged with mythic intensity. Friends withdrew, feeling that to stand too close was dangerous. Some felt drawn in, almost hypnotized, as though the empath's words carried more weight than ever before, even as they cut deep. This magnetic, unsettling quality is another hallmark of archetypal possession. The individual radiates not personal energy, but archetypal energy, pulling others into the drama, as though they were characters in an unfolding myth. Jung found this especially terrifying because it revealed the fragility of the ego. We like to believe we are in control, that our personalities are stable, that our choices are our own. But when archetypal forces erupt, the ego is swept aside like a leaf in a storm. The empath did not choose to become the destroyer, nor could they simply will themselves back to the healer. The possession had to run its course, burning itself out only when the archetype had expressed its necessary truth. For the unconscious does not rise without reason. It erupts to restore balance, to force what has been denied into recognition. In the empath's snapping, Jung saw the myth of balance written in human form. The psyche had demanded wholeness, and when denied, it called forth the archetype most opposite to the conscious identity. The healer who refused their own shadow became the destroyer, not out of malice but out of necessity. And though terrifying, this eruption was archetypal law. Whatever is excluded must return. And the greater the repression, the greater the force of its return. The empath's possession thus stood as a living example of what Jung warned against: one-sidedness. To cling only to the light, to live only as the giver, is to invite the darkness to seize you with full force. Archetypes, after all, are not gentle. They are primordial powers. They demand recognition, and when ignored, they do not whisper. They overwhelm. The empath snapping was not merely personal collapse. It was the ancient drama of archetypes, breaking through the fragile shell of individuality, a reminder that within each of us lies not only the roles we choose, but the eternal forces that choose us. There are moments in the study of the psyche when an individual's suffering reveals something far larger than themselves. Jung often warned that the personal is never merely personal, it is a fragment of the collective, a shard of the greater human story. The empath snapping, terrifying as it was, did not belong only to their own biography. It functioned as a mirror, reflecting a universal truth that concerns all of us: the shadow of humanity itself, the danger of compassion pushed beyond its limits, and the destructive turn that even our highest virtues can take when unbalanced. When Jung looked at this case, he did not see only one empath crushed by the unbearable weight of others' sorrows. He saw a reflection of the entire modern psyche, stretched thin under the burdens of collective suffering. We live in an age where voices of pain and crisis echo from every direction. Wars, injustice, oppression, the silent screams of those forgotten. The empath embodies this sensitivity in concentrated form, but in truth, we all carry fragments of that weight. We scroll through tragedies, absorb images of despair, and carry silent guilt for the suffering we cannot relieve. The empath's collapse was not only their own but a dramatization of what happens when the human soul, at both the personal and collective level, takes in more than it can hold. This is why Jung found the case so haunting. It was not only about a single patient's descent into shadow, but about the psyche of humanity itself. The empath snapping exposed a truth we resist: that even compassion, when unboundaried, can turn against itself. Just as the individual empath dissolved beneath the weight of others' suffering, so too can societies collapse when they try to carry collective pain without balance, without structure, without integration of the shadow. The mirror becomes clearer when we look at the archetypes at play. The empath embodies the archetype of the healer, but in a collective sense. This is the role we often assign to nations, movements, or communities. Figures that attempt to carry the wounds of the world, to heal history's traumas, to stand as moral guides. Yet just as the individual healer can be consumed by the shadow of the destroyer, so too can collective compassion warp into rage, vengeance, or destruction when overwhelmed. The empath's case was terrifying not because it was rare, but because it was archetypal. It showed how easily the human instinct to help can transform into its opposite when pushed past the point of endurance. Consider how the empath's snapping unfolded. Their dreams, once filled with waters of healing, gave way to visions of fire and collapse. This was not only the drama of their personal unconscious, but a symbolic echo of what happens when civilizations fail to balance their ideals. Dreams of saving turn into nightmares of burning, and what begins as compassion ends as destruction. Jung insisted that the psyche of the individual and the psyche of humanity are built from the same archetypal patterns. What happened within the empath was a microcosm of what happens in history itself. When virtue refuses to integrate its shadow, it erupts in forms of collective violence. The collective mirror is perhaps most visible in how those around the empath reacted. At first, they clung to the image of the eternal comforter, refusing to see the cracks. Even when sharpness and bitterness began to leak out, they denied it, preferring the illusion of the healer they had depended upon. Only when the snapping became undeniable did they recoil, horrified, claiming betrayal. But this reaction itself was part of the collective shadow. We demand empaths, both individuals and institutions, to bear endless suffering, to comfort endlessly, to hold the darkness on our behalf. Yet when they collapse, we turn away in judgment, refusing to admit that we created the conditions for their fall. Jung recognized this as projection. The collective disowns its own shadow, then blames the one who can no longer carry it. The empath snapping, then, revealed not just their personal limit, but the limit of humanity's illusion of boundless goodness. It forced into the open the truth that empathy, like any force, requires boundaries, balance, and integration with its opposite. Without this, compassion curdles into resentment, and the very energy meant to heal becomes a weapon. In the empath, Jung saw the reflection of our own collective refusal to face this truth. We idealize kindness but deny rage. We glorify sacrifice but ignore self-preservation. We preach healing while burying our own wounds. The snapping tore the mask away, showing us that the psyche, whether individual or collective, will not permit this imbalance forever. Archetypal possession, shadow overwhelm, individuation crisis. These were not isolated phenomena in the empath's life. They were symbolic eruptions of the same forces that drive societies, cultures, and eras of history. The empath's breakdown became a myth enacted in flesh, the myth of what happens when compassion is severed from shadow, when light is forced to exist without its counterpart. The mirror it holds up is one we often resist looking into, because it shows us that beneath our virtues lies a dangerous fragility. The more we insist on purity, the more violently the denied forces return. Jung was struck by how the empath's collapse awakened a strange recognition in those who witnessed it. As unsettling as it was, it felt familiar, as though they had seen it before in some ancient story, some cultural myth. This was because the collective unconscious speaks through such eruptions. We recognize the empath snapping not only as their personal tragedy, but as the enactment of a universal drama, the fall of the saint, the burning of the healer, the transformation of compassion into wrath. These patterns have always lived within humanity, appearing in myths, in history, in religions. The empath's case was terrifying precisely because it stripped away the symbolic veil and showed the archetype raw in a living human being. The collective mirror forces us to ask, what is our relationship with suffering, both personal and global? Do we consume it endlessly, believing that empathy alone will save us, while denying the shadow that demands balance? Do we project our wounds onto others, expecting certain souls to carry what we cannot bear? The empath's snapping revealed that such strategies cannot last. The unconscious will not allow it. What is denied in one will rise in another. What is buried in the individual will burst forth in the collective. The empath was only the vessel. The truth belongs to all of us. Carl Jung taught us that the soul does not seek perfection. It seeks wholeness. The empath snapping was not merely a story of one fragile spirit undone by too much feeling. It was a revelation of the law that governs every psyche. Light without shadow is an illusion, and compassion without boundaries becomes a hidden form of destruction. What terrified Jung was not that this person broke. It was that their breaking revealed our own reflection. We live in a world where suffering calls to us from every direction, where empathy is praised yet rarely understood, where we are taught to give endlessly, but seldom to integrate the rage, the refusal, the shadow that makes giving sustainable. The empath's collapse forces us to ask, what shadows are we denying? What archetypes wait beneath the surface, ready to possess us if we continue to live one-sided lives? The haunting truth is this: the unconscious will always have its say. If we do not confront it willingly, it will erupt violently. The day the empath snapped was not only a personal tragedy, it was a warning written in the language of the soul. And perhaps the question we must leave with is this: when our own masks begin to crack, when our carefully tended light begins to flicker, Will we have the courage to face the shadow before it consumes us?